General intro. Hello and welcome to ones, zeros and in between. My channel for centrist politics, networking, the computer kind, stats, stocks and, well, anything I want to talk about. All the sound and imagery you are about to watch has been AI generated. The script, however, was fully written by myself with no aid in the actual writing or editing by any form of AI. With that out of the way, let's begin. How to lie with stats. Excuse the flashy title, the purpose of this video isn't actually to teach you how to lie with true stats, but instead is to teach you how to spot when someone, deliberately or otherwise, is using correct stats in a misleading way. Throughout the video, we are going to make lots of references to stats, so for the sake of clarity at the start of the video, these stats are either entirely made up or outdated. This is a purposeful design choice. The video is about the way stats are presented, not the stats themselves. We'll be covering 4 broad topics on stat discussion. The topics we are covering are far from exhaustive and will be relatively high level, so I encourage you to dig into them more. Let's begin. A difference in definition. There was a time a few years ago when I could have said the average wage in the UK was £21,000 or £68,000, and I would have been technically telling the truth with either statement. To take it a step further, I could have said the average wage in the UK was £21,000, £28,000, £32,000, £56,000 or £68,000, and all of these would have been true statements. Now, at a logical level, having 5 vastly different values for the average wage in the UK can't be true, but that leads us onto one of the most common cases of how people can be misled with stats. And that is because there is a difference in definition. You see, when talking about stats at a technical or analytical level, a lot of time is given to defining what you mean when you say or use certain words. And in our example, each of the figures given above, they have a different definition for the word average. You see, the word average is a conversational word for the most part, and you, the listener, can normally work out what the speaker means by the word average, depending on the context they use it. For example, if I said that my average trip to the supermarket tends to cost me £30, you would understand I mean that the most common amount of money I spend when I go to the supermarket is about £30. Contrast this to splitting a bill for a large group at a restaurant. An average bill of £80 here would be all the dinners added together divided by the amount of people who are paying. However, if we were to use the same definition of the word average as I did when I went shopping, it could vary, as I generally might prefer cheaper restaurants and only spend £30 when I normally go to one by myself. So then, in our examples, what do our different values actually represent? Well, that would be the different type of averages, with the ones you would be most familiar with being the mode, median and mean. When we look at average wages in the UK, this way it can change our figures massively. For those that are curious, I'll explain what those different types of averages are. Mode is the term used when describing the most common value or range of values in a data set. In the above example, this is £21,000, or more accurately, between the values of £20,500 to £21,499. This is also the type of average I described above in my shopping trip example. The median is the term used for defining the middle value in a data set. In the above example, this is £28,000 or £32,000. These are 2 different types of median, a relative and absolute median, but they are beyond the scope of this explanation. If we had a data set of people's heights and our group was 5'2", 5'4", 5'6", 5'7", and 6'4", the median height would be 5'6", despite the fact the mean height would be 5'7". Our final average is the mean. This is the term used for defining the value we get when we add all the values in a data set together and then divide by a certain number, most commonly but not always the amount of values in our data set. And in our above example, we have £56,000 as a relative geometric mean and £68,000 as an absolute mean. Again, going into relative versus absolute and explaining what a geometric mean are is beyond the scope of this explanation. Now, when we view the headline or statement attached to a data set, we know the first question we need to ask ourselves is, does the statement definition of words match the dataset definition of words? Selective data. The second most common issue I see with misleading statements about stats is that the stat itself has selective data gathering, or a statement has been made from selective samples within a dataset. Again, the data itself might not be wrong and may be selective for a reason, but when a statement applying it to a wider context gets used, we can get misled. Now we've had an outdated example, so it's time for a made-up ones. Let's start with selective data gathering. Imagine you had a survey that was reporting that a company had a low employee satisfaction rate, let's say of only 30%. This could then be used to create a statement that it's a bit shit to work for this company. However, when you dig into the survey, you find that the only people surveyed in the company were the poorest 10% of performing branches. In this case, the company has likely commissioned the survey to try and improve those underperforming branches, opposed to the whole company being shit to work for, or the company might actually be a poor place to work. Either way, you can't define what the company is like to work for as a whole from the data gathered. For selective samples within a data set, we could have an example of a statement that states that more people now have a car because households with at least one car has gone up in the past 5 years. However, when you look at the data, you see there are also categories for 2 cars, 3 or more cars, and no cars in a household. And when you look at the data set as a whole, you can see that households with 2 or 3 plus cars has been decreasing over recent years, leading to an increase in 1 car and 0 car households. When viewed more holistically like this, the more logical conclusion could be that your typical household is actually decreasing the amount of cars they have. It's just that the 1 car households that are becoming 0 car households are happening at a slower rate when compared to 2 or 3 plus car households becoming 1 car households. So the next 2 questions we need to ask ourselves when looking at a headline statement is, what data was actually gathered? And what does the full data tell me? When combined with our first question regarding definitions, we should be able to deal with most false statements attached to true stats. It's not actually that big of a deal. The next issue when looking at statements attached to stats is one we are all familiar with: clickbait headlines blowing something out of proportion. It might be the millennial in me, but the place I most commonly see this going on is the more traditional mainstream media, but thankfully it is normally pretty obvious. To make up an obvious example, we could go with a statement akin to drinking Pepsi Max halves your chances of getting cancer. My love of Pepsi Max aside, this is obviously not going to be the case. And when you dig into the data or study behind the claim, what you find is a study showing that people who drank 1 to 2 cans of Pepsi Max a day had a 0.0000025%, or a 1 in 4 million chance of getting a single particular type of cancer, compared to people who drank no Pepsi Max, who have a 0.00005%, or 1 in 2 million chance of getting that type of cancer. Notice how the data doesn't go into how treatable, severe, or anything else important when it comes to cancer. In this case, a 1 in 2 million versus a 1 in 4 million chance is still pretty negligible either way, and wouldn't justify you drinking more Pepsi Max other than for its delicious taste. Now, the above example is a silly example because of how extreme the numbers are, but let's look at a more serious example. This is another real but outdated example. Back in the late noughties, the west of Scotland was stated to have the worst drivers in the UK. This statement derived from the figure that West Scotland had the highest number of minor road traffic offences per licensed drivers, about 25 offences per year per 1,000 qualified drivers. This at the time led to an increased policing of the west of Scotland's roads, which ironically led to an increase in offences, which led to increased policing. It wasn't until almost 10 years later that a full study on the stats for driving offences UK-wide found that the mean number of offences for an area was about 20 offences per 1,000 drivers, with a standard deviation of about 7. What does this term standard deviation mean? It means that if an area had between 13 to 27 offences per 1,000 drivers, it could be considered normal/typical of the area. In this example, people misunderstanding the significance of the stats led to a real-world impact. So the fourth question we should ask ourselves is, even if the statement and the data is true, how significant is that really? Poorly gathered data. So for our first 3 broad topics and 4 questions, we have worked under the assumption that the statement and misunderstanding of correct data has been our issue. But what if the problem lies with the data itself? I need to preface this section with a little warning. Researchers and data analysts are meant to be able to put aside their feelings and listen to constructive criticism on their studies. However, researchers and analysts are still human and may get defensive when criticized. If you want to criticize someone's study, be sure to do it in a respectful way that is constructive, and even then be prepared for blowback. There are an endless amount of ways data can be gathered poorly. To keep this short, I will be focusing on 3: biased samples, vagueness, and my personal favourite, inadequate sample size. To show all 3, we are going to go back to a made-up example. This time we are gathering data on the general population's feelings on what pet they love better, cats or dogs. Now, personal preferences aside, team cat for the win, if we had a study that showed an overwhelming support for dogs, we might be inclined to believe it. However, the data itself could be poorly gathered. An obvious example showcasing a biased sample would be, who did you ask? If you asked people who were entering or leaving a park, your answers could naturally skew towards dogs because of the simple fact that there will be more dog people in a park walking their dog. Less obvious would be asking people who lived more urban or rural lives, opposed to living in the city, where certain aspects of that lifestyle could predispose you to preferring a certain pet over another. Another way we could conflate the data is vagueness in the answering of the questions. For example, the question could be presented as, what do you prefer, cats or dogs? This could lead to our answer of overwhelming support for dogs because the option is binary. Simply adding in the options of both or none could give us a more even split. Likewise, vagueness can be introduced by having too many options like cats, dogs, both, none, cats a little, dogs a lot, dogs a little, cats a lot, and so on. This could turn a well-meaning study into a mishmash mess, with the people answering not sure what they are actually being questioned on. Vagueness can also be introduced if you don't declare the context of when, where, and how you are answering the question. If asked during the dead of winter when it's cold and rainy, it could show a real appreciation for dogs, but similarly, if asked at the height of summer, it could be man's best fair weather friend. And lastly, the one issue it almost always comes down to when looking at poorly gathered data is sample size. This one should be pretty obvious. In the UK, there is a rough estimate of 17 million pet owners. If I only ask 17 their thoughts on what is better, cats or dogs, I wouldn't be getting anything close to a representative sample. There's a sum you do to work out how big a sample you would need to be a certain level of confident in your results. Generally speaking, the levels of confidence you most commonly go for are 95%, 99%, and 99.9%. So how many would you need to ask to be that confident? For 95%, you would need about 380. For 99%, you would need about 670. And for 99.9%, you would need about 1,100. Whereas 17 would give you a confidence level of 30%. As you can see, all of these are a far cry from 17, though it may have surprised you how low you need to be confident. This is provided your sample isn't biased and your questions aren't vague. Questions to ask. So with all that, let's summarize our questions to ask when we see a statement attached to any study or data, especially the ones that agree with our own biases. 1. Does the statement and the data use the same definitions? 2. What data was actually gathered? 3. What does the full dataset look like attached to this statement? 4. Is the data presented actually showing me anything significant? 5. Is the sample biased? 6. Were the methods used to gather the data appropriate to the statement? 7. Is the dataset big enough to make meaningful comparisons? Outro. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, could you please like, comment and subscribe, as middle-centrist videos by their very nature are not clickbait or rage-inducing, and the best way to improve the algorithm for content like this is to engage with it. Until next time, IO out.